What's up, folks? Gabe Montgomery here, 10 Horse Money YouTube channel. And when should you choose a spinnerbait versus a swim jig versus a bladed jig? That's a question that runs through my head all the time, and you kind of got to have them all tied on and figure that out once you get to the lake. Most days the fish will tell you which one is going to work better than the other, but you have to go through a rotation. Sometimes you land on it right off the bat. Sometimes you just have to work through all three of them, go through the different colors and different variations and different trailers before you figure out what the fish are wanting that day. So let's just talk about maybe some of the situations where I think some of them outperform the other. The spinnerbait, and I'm thinking this is springtime, we're spawn, post-spawn, but we've had a lot of rain lately and the water is stained. So something that excels in dirty high water is a big Thunder Thumper Colorado bladed spinnerbait. Got a size 7 Colorado blade on there, and you guys that watch my channel, you've seen me throw this around a lot. Got a lot of confidence in a big spinnerbait. It gets a lot of big bites when the water is muddy, and that's all year long, not just in the spring, all year long. I like to put a big swim bait on there just to increase the profile, adds a little bit of lift. You can slow it down, but the chatterbait also works well in the same kind of conditions. So you've got to have them both tied on and try them throughout the day, alternate between them. The swim jig, it works too, but I would say I usually start with the spinnerbait and I go to the chatterbait before I will go to the swim jig. Another time when I think the spinnerbait excels over the others is when you've got a shad spawn going on. The flash of the blade of a spinnerbait just represents the shad really well. You know, if you got an area where there's a shad spawn going on, I'm going to be starting out with, you know, willow leaf blade. I'm putting the Colorado blades away, but something that represents those smaller shad. You know, you've got to kind of figure out what size shad you got and base your blade off of that. But spinnerbait seems to excel in those conditions. Also in wind, when you've got heavy wind, it seems like that spinnerbait just draws them out a little bit better than some of the other ones. And you know, I'm just kind of throwing this off the top of my head here. If you've got situations where you think one excels over the other, let me know. Leave them in the comment sections, or if you've got anything to add to that, please do. Colors on the spinnerbaits. Stain water, obviously you're going to be throwing something that's white or white and chartreuse. I like a gold and silver blade 95% of the time. If you're in a clear water situation, you've got wind, cloud cover, something that's kind of translucent, kind of see-through is going to usually perform better than something that's really bold like a white and chartreuse. But you have to try them and find out. As far as another trailer that I put on the spinnerbait, I like this split tail trailer by Zoom. Let's talk about cover, because that's kind of important. What are you throwing this bait around? You know, if you're fishing a lot of laydowns, spinnerbait is hard to beat, and a swim jig is right in there with them. Now, chatterbait works great, but the problem that you'll have with a chatterbait is it's notorious for getting hung up around wood. There are a few things you can do to help decrease the amount of hang-ups, and one is the trailer selection. If you use something that's flat, like a Rage Crawl or this Rage Bug by Strike King, something that's got a flat side, what that does is it encourages that chatterbait or that bladed jig to come up over the wood. It really keeps it from rolling. It makes a big difference. If you've got something like a swim bait on there, it has a tendency to just roll over and grab that wood. So that's something you can do that's going to help you come through that cover a little bit better. I mentioned the shad spawn, and the swim jig is another great choice for shad spawn. So if you're in the shad spawn, or you know that the fish are feeding on shad, it's hard to beat, you know, the spinner. I think the spinnerbait and the swim jig is going to excel over the chatterbait.
We talked about forage. To me, I believe that the swim jig and the bladed jig do a much better job of representing the bluegill than a spinnerbait does. Bluegill don't have all that flash. Shad do. So anytime I think that the fish are feeding on bluegill, and some of the prime times that they're feeding on bluegill are during the spawn, because the bluegill are always around their nest trying to pick off their eggs, and in the post spawn, because that's when the bluegill move up and make their beds, and the big bass, it's kind of a revenge thing, man. They seek them out. So this right here, if you got bluegill going on, the bladed jig and black and blue bladed jig is something that I throw a lot. You know, a green pumpkin works good too. If you got clear water, the green pumpkin's probably going to be a little bit better. But if the water is stained, I do like that black and blue. Although that's just a rule of thumb. They both work in both conditions.
It's hard to beat a black and blue chatterbait, black and blue bladed jig. I like to put a little speed crawl on there, a rage crawl, a Z crawl, just something that's flat, something that's got a lot of flappers on there when I'm doing the bluegill thing. You know, when a swim jig is the same way. One of my favorite swim jigs to throw up shallow is this Cumberland Pro Limit Out Compact Swim Jig, but I like a 1/4 ounce weight if I'm fishing really shallow. I put a big rage crawl on there so you can really slow it, but something black and blue or something that's bluegill color. This has got a menace on there. So around a bluegill spawn or when the bass are feeding on bluegill, the swim jig and the bladed jig are going to outperform a spinnerbait because, you know, the spinnerbait's got all that flash and the shad have flash, but the bluegill not so much. I just think of the three, those are your two better options. Now fishing out deep, out off the ends of the laydowns and stuff, they all three work. In grass, they all three work. You know, they fish a little bit different, but you're fishing for the same fish. And I think it's hard to favor one over the other. You just have to let the fish tell you what they want for that given day.
Another thing to consider is, are you skipping that bait around cover? Are you fishing docks? Are you fishing laydowns? You know, overhanging trees, places that you need to slide that bait up underneath there. If you are, the spinnerbait is definitely out. In my opinion, a swim jig is the ultimate skipping bait, and the chatterbait skips pretty good too. So that's something you need to consider.
Another time I think that the swim jig excels over the other two mentioned is on pressured fish. Something like this compact swim jig is excellent for catching those pressured fish. It's a lot more stealthy. You know, it doesn't have the flash of a spinnerbait. It doesn't have the thump of the bladed jig. It's real stealthy. It just kind of appears and it comes through the water. It does a great job of representing a shad. And I think, and I know you can go behind people that have fished an area with a swim jig, especially if they're throwing a spinnerbait or a chatterbait, and you can pick up some fish that they left behind.
Now in the fall, a lot of times I will throw this white swim jig versus a spinnerbait or a chatterbait. When the fish are feeding on those shad, especially the schooling fish, this does better than the other two, hands down. If you've got schooling fish, you want to be throwing a swim jig around those schooling fish.
Really, it boils down to watercolor, the mood of the fish, and the kind of cover. Each one of these baits excels in the different environments that you put it in.
They all three do good in grass. They're just a little bit different look. You know, I mentioned earlier that you have to have all three tied on, and that's certainly true because there are days when they want the flash of the spinnerbait. There are days when they want that thump of the bladed jig, and then there are days when they just want something silent. They want something sneaking around, and you're fishing this basically in the same areas. They all three fish in the same areas.
All three of these baits have a time and place, and you just have to keep them all on the deck and make a rotation and see what the fish want for that given day. A lot of times, put one in your hand for 10 or 15 minutes, go through areas that you have confidence in. If it's not working, pick up another style of bait. So start with the spinnerbait and then go to the chatterbait and then go to the swim jig. And after, you know, an hour or so, you'll get a feel. And if you think that the fish are feeding on shad primarily, you definitely want to key with white baits. If it's a bluegill thing, you want to go with your black and blues or your green pumpkins. Just make your way through the area, give it an hour or two, and figure out if they are chasing a moving bait.
Another time when I think that the swim jig excels over the other two is when you got really calm conditions. You've got no wind, even if it's cloudy, you got no wind. This little swim jig is a lot more stealthy. I don't think it freaks the fish out as much as the big thump of, you know, a bladed jig or the flash of a spinnerbait. So definitely think about that. Conversely, if you've got a lot of wind, the spinnerbait and the bladed jig are going to outperform the swim jig, in my opinion. So you kind of got to look at your conditions. If you've got really stained water, maybe you need something that's going to be thumping. If you've got a lot of wind, maybe you need something that's got a lot of flash. Bright skies, sometimes the fish want flash of a spinnerbait of a willow leaf. So you got to kind of take all that into consideration, but you definitely want to have all three of them tied on and just make a cast, you know, pick up one and cast it, you know, for 20 minutes in productive areas. If you don't get bit, pick up another one. If you're seeing fish follow one, pick up the other. If you're getting bit on one but they're not quite committing, pick up the other and just do a little rotation. And 9 times out of 10, you're going to find that one of those baits is going to outproduce the other on any given day.
As far as trailers on the swim jig, I keep it kind of simple. This is just my take on this. Rage Menace is hard to beat. The Rage Crawl, when I'm fishing really shallow, if I'm fishing like say 0 to maybe 5 feet and I want this thing to really float, that Rage Crawl's got those crazy flippers on there and it's got flat side and it keeps that bait up. I can slow roll it. The Rage Menace, I typically use it when I'm wanting to get out just a hair deeper. It's got pretty good action, not as crazy as the Rage Crawl, but definitely some more action. And then I'll also put like a 3 to 3.5 inch swim bait on there, the paddle tail. On the bladed jigs, it's the same thing. You know, a Z-Crawl, a lot of guys like a Zako or a Razor Shad, something that's definitely that minnow shape. I like a Rage Crawl, like a Zoom Speed Crawl. You got a lot of different variables. You can put a swim bait on there. It's all the same. You know, I've got this jackhammer over here. This is rigged up with a Reaction Innovations Little Dipper. The white trash, this is a white jackhammer 1/2 ounce. It pairs up nicely with this. Catching a lot of fish on this the last few years. I'll leave links to these products in the description box if you want to go check them out. You know, the swim jig is a little bit easier to keep deep. You know, it wants to stay down a little bit better. It doesn't have a blade like the spinnerbait or the bladed jig chatterbait. So if I'm fishing out a little bit deeper, I tend to rely on the swim jig a lot. You can definitely slow roll it down to 15 or so feet. It gets down and it stays down. And it's also really good around schooling fish. You know, in the post spawn, these fish they'll kind of get out off these points and offshore. And a lot of times you'll have some schooling activity and you can throw this thing through those schools of bass and get a lot of bites. You can do the same with the chatterbait and the spinnerbait, but I think this is better for that situation than the other two. That's all I got for you folks. Just wanted to touch on that because I often have the same question. You know, I'm always wondering, is it going to be a swim jig, a bladed jig, or a spinnerbait, or is it going to be a moving bite at all? But bottom line is you got to take them all out there. You got to throw them around. You got to see what's going on. I hope this video helps you out. Please leave comments and let me know what some of your go-to baits are. If I missed anything, do you have better trailers than I, better situations? I'm just curious because this is a community. I learn just as much from you guys as I hope you will learn from me, and I'm just sharing some of my experiences with you. And this is by no means an absolute, because there are no absolutes in fishing. Every day is different. And the beauty of this sport is there's so many people out there doing it that they've come up with different ways of doing it and different ways to apply these certain baits in certain situations. So please give me a thumb up if you appreciate the content, and subscribe if you're new to the channel and you have not. And that's all I got. Till next time.